G'day guys, welcome back to the workshop. Before we get into today's how to forge, I just wanted to take a quick moment to talk about stock. Now, stock can come in a variety of sizes and shapes. Obviously, if you are using known stock, you'll have flat bar, but there's also things like coil spring, files, bearing races, ball bearings, all kinds of stuff. If we're going to use unknown stock, we still want to start with a usable shape. Now you can see here that these known stock materials, it's actually 2 bars of 1084 and the thin bar is 1075. They're all of different sizes, different thicknesses. The ideal starting thickness and width for a beginner would be inch by quarter inch, like this piece of mild steel here. But in the event you don't have it, sometimes it's best to just make some, which is what I did here. I forged down a 2 inch by quarter inch piece of 1084. And then we put it on a handle. And the reason we put it on a handle is because it makes it easier to manipulate. Now in the last video I did, we didn't forge in the tip. But this is the method I will use if I only have a flat surface to forge in a tip. Especially if I'm trying to do an obtuse tip. Just knock those corners in at a sharp 45-degree angle, both sides, and then, obviously dress the mushrooming as it goes. But this will stop us from getting fish mouthing, which is something that you will quite commonly get if you try and forge straight into a point on a flat piece of bar. And the reason quarter inch by inch is the best size of stock for beginners is because it is thick enough that it will withstand horizontal blows like these without buckling too much. But it's also large enough to make pretty much any kind of knife you can think of, except the very large buoys and stuff like that. You can get some really nice size blades out of quarter inch by inch stock. Now, once we've pushed the corners in, we can then start pushing that tip over to start making our spear point preform. Now, if I wanted to make a blade that had a clip point, I would make this a straight line down to the point. But because I want a sort of almost straight backed drop point, I want to curve it, because as the bevel curves that point out, it's actually going to straighten the spine. If I was to leave that forged in taper quite straight, then it would actually forge a reverse curve, a clip point, much like on a Bowie knife. But that's not what I'm desiring for this build. So you'll notice here, once I've got to the very close to the very sharp point, I'm going to bring it right to the edge of the anvil, and I'm going to use light, rapid blows to get it right down to sharp. I want as close to sharp as I can on the point, because that means that there's going to be less grinding to do in the final profile. But of course you can leave it a little bit thicker and grind it out later. I just like to be a little bit more accurate. Once we've got our point established, we're going to start performing our tapering. Now, I want to distal taper on this blade, like in any blade I make. But before I make a distal taper, I'm going to make sure that it tapers slightly towards the point from the point where the ricasso is going to begin. The reason for this is because as we draw out the distal taper, it's actually going to widen slightly, even though we're going to use a peen in this case, unlike when we did the full Tang knife, which if you haven't seen, I will link to. We're going to taper all the way to the point, and then when we come to draw the material out a little bit to get some length and some distal taper, we're going to get a little bit of widening of the stock. And so here we're using a straight peen hammer from Hans Groff at Charming Hollow Forge. Nice wide peen, and we're just starting with light blows near the ricasso area and getting heavier and more consistent towards the tip to influence that taper. You should be able to see that taper starting there. And now with the flat hammer, we're going to come in and dress the taper. We're going to come in and get rid of all of the peen marks. And this is where that widening happens. You can see it right near the original bar stock thickness. It has widened significantly, which we're going to have to dress before we come on to forging the bevels. Now the reason it curved during that process was because the spine was slightly thicker than the edge, because that's where I'd been doing most of my forging, and I wasn't dressing the thickness as much as I should. You could have kept it curved, and you left that curve to resist your edge beveling. That is a way to do it, but I prefer to start with a straight blank. It makes it easier for me to direct, but that's entirely up to you. You can pre-curve your blades. I may do a how to forge where I pre-curve the blade at some point in the future. But once we've got the flats dressed and the taper is in, you can see it's a nice uniform taper, starting at 6mm down to about 3mm at the point. We can then go in and we're going to set our plunge cut. One more dressing cycle. Okay, so just like with the full Tang, we're going to cut in the plunge cut with the edge of our hammer and the edge of the anvil, making sure to flip it over and making sure to really isolate on that plunge cut. The hammer is actually angled backwards towards the ricasso a little bit, so that we're actually cutting with the edge rather than trying to hit with the full flat face of the hammer. And once it's cold, we're going to throw it back in the forge, but at least we should have two distinct shoulders ready for us to continue cutting that in. And I'm going to keep cutting that in until I see about 1/4 of an inch of drop or more. You should be able to get about the width of your stock in drop when drawing out the bevels. So, you know, from a 1/4 inch billet, you should be able to get 1/4 inch of drop out of the 1/4 inch of width when drawing the bevels. Out of any blade blank. There are ways to forge that will not get that drop, but we're using the pinch technique of forging, where we're actually starting our blows about 1/2 to 3/4 of the way up the blade and pushing down towards the edge. The only place where we don't do that is right on that plunge cut, where we want to isolate directly on the corner and then slowly walk it backwards in order to make sure that that line stays true. Because the last thing we want to do is overcut the plunge cut so that it cuts over the spine. Otherwise that'll cause a stepping of the spine and it just doesn't look very good. But once the plunge cut is established, we're going to keep the ricasso off the anvil, and we're going to start moving our bevels up the blade, working a half hammer face, overlapping with each series, with each heat. And we're going to draw it down to the same edge thickness along the entire length of the blade, and that's going to mean that we're going to have a nice even width of the blade, and we're also going to have a nice even edge bevel that's not going to be wrinkly and have lots of lumps in it. I was asked a very good question on the full Tang knife video in the comment section, which was, does the angle become more obtuse or acute when you get towards the tip? And it actually gets more acute. So you want to actually, I do it preternaturally, I just kind of do it by habit, but you actually want to lay the blade slightly flatter, and you'll notice that I'm turning the blade so that the edge bevel is basically 90 degrees to the anvil face. I'm almost turning it like I would on the grinder. And that's actually making the angle to the blade and the anvil be a little bit finer of an angle. And that's because the blade is distally tapered. And so therefore there is not as thick material at the point as there was at the ricasso. And so the angle needs to be slightly lower in order to have that bevel go all the way up the blade. And now that we've forged it, we've got a bit of a banana, we're going to use our wood block to start straightening. And the wrinkling can be dressed into itself with a hammer, like normal. It'll actually upset back into itself, which means that you can just dress that edge back to thickness. And because there was a little bit more edge deviation, and there is another method to straighten things, we're going to whack forge it. Now, whack forging, this is one of the reasons why you want a handle or a bar. Doing this in tongs is almost impossible. It will just fly out of the tongs, and it's very dangerous, so only do that if you've got it attached to a handle or a bar. But like correcting with the wood block, it will cause deformation of the edge and the spine, so you're going to need to go back in and dress that with a hammer to make sure everything's nice and straight. And make sure your ricasso's flat. Because the next step is to dress the ricasso in and then start cutting the Tang shoulders. Now, when dressing in the ricasso, you don't want to forge too heavily on the spine, because you will cause a dip. So if you want to push the ricasso up the blade a little bit more, you will have to flip it over and forge on the flat of the anvil using the hammer to cut it in. One of the better ways to do this is if you have a friend who's a striker, or you can use as a striker, grab a set hammer and use a set hammer and a striker to push that ricasso back up. That's probably the safest and easiest way. If you have a press, you can use a large flat die and a smaller flat die in order to do that same thing. But yeah, you don't want to do too many over the edge of the anvil forging. And now we're going to cut in the Tang shoulders using the edge of the anvil at a slight angle. We're going to use the edge of the hammer, much like when we're cutting in the plunge cut. We're going to angle the blade down, and then we're going to cut with the edge of the hammer and the edge of the anvil, flipping regularly and forging only lightly. We only need to give myself a reference at this point, because we're going to cut it off the bar and we're going to turn it around and use the other edge of the anvil, which is a little bit more controllable. But this just gives us an idea. And I always end up going about 1/4 of an inch, 6mm, further back on the ricasso than I eventually plan to have, because you can almost never get them perfectly aligned by forging. So what I end up doing is grinding or filing those shoulders in later on, but just to give myself the isolation, I make sure that it's a little bit further back than I want it. I'm going to cut it off, and you don't want to cut all the way through. Occasionally I'll show myself cutting all the way through on my videos, but most of the time I try and avoid it. And if you are going to cut all the way through, make sure you're hitting on the piece that is hanging over the other side and not directly onto the edge of your hot cut, because otherwise you'll damage your hammer and the hot cut. But now it's broken off, we can flip it around, put it in some bladesmithing tongs, and get to forging that Tang in. And again, we're going to use the edge of the anvil, slightly low angle, using the edge of the hammer to chop in. And once I've established only, probably a 1/16, maybe an 1/8 if it's, looking a little heavy, of a step between the ricasso and the Tang, I'm going to start forging out that Tang taper, because at the end of the day, as long as you've got sufficient material, you shouldn't need too heavy a step in your Tang shoulders, and a lot of people make the mistake of overstepping their Tang shoulders and making it quite a narrow Tang at the shoulders in forging. You actually could not do shoulders at all and have it just taper from the ricasso thickness down to the end of the Tang with no shouldering, and then cut the shoulders in manually later with, a file or a grinder. But if you're going to forge Tang shoulders, make sure they're narrow, make sure they're quite fine. And then of course we're just going to beat the ever-loving hell out of it to draw out that Tang, trying to create a nice even taper in 2 dimensions, so tapering vertically and horizontally, so that the thickest point is where the Tang shoulders are. It's really important to keep those Tang shoulders off the anvil if you're going to be forging in the vertical plane, because anything that's on the anvil is going to move. So if I pushed that ricasso onto the anvil, then I would actually push the tang off-center to the tang shoulders, which is not what you want. You can cut in tang shoulders another way, which is with a guillotine tool, or with a press if you have a press, or a power hammer. I actually sold my guillotine tool with the old anvil. I need to get myself a new one. But yeah, this is how to forge blades with nothing but your anvil. And once I think I've got a taper, you've got to remember you can leave your tang a little bit thicker than you need, because you can always grind it down. It's one of those places where the shape isn't super critical. But if you're, you know, a detail-oriented person, let's say, like me, then you'll want to get it nice and dressed and not want to spend too much time at the grinder. So clean, even tapers is what you want. So of course, after doing all of that heavy forging, it is going to bend the blade a little bit. So we're going to straighten her out, get it all back in alignment, make sure that everything's straight. You'll see me looking down the end of the tongs, like we talked about in the full tang making video. You actually want to look tip towards you, and I did that off camera for a straightening cycle, but this is the final forging shot. Just doing my general straightening, keeping that ricasso off the edge. And this is one of those tricks that you don't see very often, which is to push the plunge cut over. You actually strike the ricasso, keeping the plunge cut on the anvil. You actually strike the ricasso and you can push the plunge cut one side or the other. It's something that I try not to have to do too often. If you're doing even amounts of forging, you won't have that problem of having to push the heel of the blade over. But if you do find that the heel is to one side or the other, all you do, put the plunge cut, or, you know, put the blade on the anvil with the plunge cut at the edge of the anvil, and then strike at the ricasso. And you will actually push that blade over. Don't do it too much though, because you'll actually end up mangling the blade. And that's almost it's almost unfixable. So here we have the finished blade. You know, there is a bit of profile grinding to be done, as in any forging, but it's nice and straight. You can see there, the tang is slightly offline, but I can actually do that. I can fix that cold. The edge is nice and centered. Plunge cuts are even. Tang shoulders are even. Nice distal taper. Nice clean blade. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this video on how to forge a ricassoed hidden tang knife. This is a fairly generic style that you'll see in a lot of ABS knives and that kind of thing, so it's quite common to see this kind of style forged. And it is a little tricky, but hopefully this video will have helped you get a hang of how to do it. If there are any kind of designs you would like to see me forge, any styles of knives that you would like to see me do a video like this on, please leave a recommendation down in the comments below, because I'm always happy to do this. And I want to make this more of a series, so I do have one more video already filmed for this series, so if you want to see more like it, subscribe, make sure to hit that notification icon to be notified when I upload new videos. And if you want access to behind the scenes and get access to these videos before everyone else, you can join this wonderful group of people, my wonderful patrons who make this kind of stuff possible, including supplying me with the finances to supply better audio recording equipment, video recording equipment, you know, forges, all that kind of stuff. They make this channel run. So if you want to help support me like that, the links will be down in the description below. But with that being said, I'm going to shuffle off. It's a little warm in here. I hope you have a fantastic day. I'll see you next time.